Welcome to Why Postliberalism Failed. Today is August 9th, 2024. I'm James Patterson. With me, as always, is Thomas Howes. We have a guest today. It's Catherine Pakaluk. She is a professor at Catholic University of America, and she works primarily in economics, but she's also published a book recently. What was the press, Catherine? Regnery, called Hannah's Children. Catherine, welcome to the podcast, Why Postliberalism Failed.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So the reason that you're on here is not just to talk about the book, but from a particular valence, namely the rise of post-liberal politics, something that's it's creeping up and then suddenly all at once. And in some respects, your work is particularly relevant because post-liberals like to stress the significance of the decline of marriage rates and childbirth among married or people of a certain age, and they tout the examples of policies from places like Hungary, and you are focused on the same problem but come at it from a probably antithetical almost sort of perspective as them. So before we get to that post-liberal valence, though, let's lay some groundwork here and tell us about what inspired you to write this book, Hannah's Children, and what the major claims are.
Great. Wow. What inspired me to write this book was, I will say, in part, this concern about low birth rates, but then bringing to the table, I think, I guess I'd say a functional image of civilizational health, right? So I think, and this is something that I hope will form the basis of a lot of our conversation. But so birth rates are falling, and then everybody's, Chicken Little. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? But I'm firmly of the view that we can't formulate proper responses, both at the family level, neighborhood level, local level, or at the policy level, without understanding what civilizational health looks like, or aspects, habits of civilizational health. So in the midst of this birth dearth, this declining birth rates, as an economist, I studied it for a long time, and I thought about it, looked at all the models, studied it. I thought, an interesting thing to do would be to say, well, who's immune from the birth dearth? Is anybody immune? In a sense, if no one's immune, if everybody deterministically experiences lower birth rates, well, then there's sort of nothing to investigate. You say, well, this is just a feature of modernity. But if you look around, you say, actually, there's pockets of people who are not suffering this catastrophic loss of, we'll say, hope or confidence in the future, whatever you want to call having children. Well, then it would seem like a really good idea to study those people. And then if you found out that they all had sort of, purple birthmarks, or something else that just sort of rendered them, useless from a policy perspective, you'd throw up your hands and say, well, okay, some people are immune, but there's nothing we can do. I doubted that was the case. I knew there was a significant number of people. We knew already that the people still having children today are more likely to say that they practice a religious so they belong to what I would call a living religious community, but kind of the mechanism and what that looks like has been pretty unclear, has been pretty, I would say, hidden from the popular view. So the simple idea was to go out and talk to people who are immune from this disease of modernity, which is, failing to replace itself, and discover what things we could learn from those people. And so that was the inspiration. And, sort of simply put, I think I discovered that, as we would expect, that there are things that these communities of people exhibit, beliefs that they have, like habits and things that they do that are possible to not only study, but they can be known, they can inform public policy. And so we could talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, that was the idea. And once I've had a chance to sort of share these findings with people, I think they really resonate because we get that in other areas of human life, say just sort of healthfulness in general. And I'm using this analogy of disease and health. In healthfulness in general, we wouldn't try to formulate policy that would encourage people to become more healthy based solely on looking at people who are unhealthy, right? That would be a mistake. And actually we see some of that, right? So it gets at this idea that sort of being healthy as a civilization, as a people, is not the same as, sort of not being not healthy, that there are different kinds of, we'll say, motives and drives. And so the question was, what are those things that relate to hope and confidence in the future to have children?
So there is survey work that we see often referred to among people that are similarly concerned as you, that says that
Mm,
women claim to want to have more children than they have. And so the question is, what did you find were the contexts in which these women were able to have such children? And
mm.
also, just as an aside, do you find that when people pose these survey questions, is that something that you might think women would be inclined to answer a certain way, given
Yeah,
that this is a very personal question and surveys
right.
are often quite impersonal?
Yeah, so I like the way you've brought us to this question about sort of fertility surveys and surveys in general. One of the reasons to do this kind of in-depth qualitative interviewing, which I did, and economists don't do this anymore, not very often, and to an increasing extent, sociologists don't do this anymore. This kind of interest and drive in talking to individuals and doing long form interviews, really trying to get into the heart of the matter. And that's important. And some people have said, well, what's the value of that for social science? And a big part of the value of that is to inform better survey questions in the future.
Yeah.
So just as a quick, for instance, that everybody can understand, a common survey question about family size asks people, how many children you're planning to have or expect to have. But as a, for instance, women who believe that they discern the size of their family on a kind of a one at a time basis in a kind of prayerful consideration with God, right? You can already see this isn't going to add up to a simple, yeah, I'm planning to have 5 kind of question. So I think these survey questions need to be obviously improved. You've raised a good point. It's not always clear that we can trust the responses on surveys about intended or desired family size. Okay, so you first asked about what we know about these kind of surveys that say that women want to have more children than they end up having. And I want to set aside one potential mistake right at the beginning. And that is to say that there are 2 types of phenomena we could study today. One is that we know that sort of biological infertility, couples struggling with various types of infertility, that's been on the rise for the last several decades.
Wow.
And that's not totally well understood. But I want to set that aside from what I'm about to say, because if I didn't do that, it could sound somewhat callous. Setting aside cases where women are trying to conceive, couples are trying to grow their family and they can't, setting that aside. What we have seen for several decades is that really, in fact, since the 1960s, early 1970s, in this kind of survey data, is that women, when asked at the beginning of their childbearing years, kind of how many kids they hope or expect to have, and even maybe how many kids they think would be ideal for a family to have, there are a lot of ways these survey questions try to get at that fertility intentions, we'll say. What we've seen is that the completed cohorts, when you come back and talk to those same women in their 40s and 50s, each of these cohorts since the 1960s has had about 1 fewer children in their than they intended to have. And so people talking about the birth dearth and the low birth rates, they make a lot of noise about this. And I discuss this in my book. I think it's really important evidence for us to have on the table. But I think it's something that we have to, there's a caution, there's a really important caution. And I think this comes from the sort of the way that economists think about choice, which is kind of like, if you lock me in a room and you ask me like, or genie in a bottle, and you say, like, how many Cokes would you like to have? The story, or, how many BMW M3s would you like to have? I know for me, the answer is at least 1, and that's 1 more than I have, right? Like, I'd really like if it could be like a 6-speed manual, all the better. So that's
Very
1
good
more.
taste.
Yeah, right. I mean, so that's 1 more than I currently have. So there's a gap. There's like a BMW M3 6-speed manual gap right? When we talk to women about the fertility intentions, we call this a fertility gap. There's this gap. They say 3, but then they have 2, right? And so thinking about the BMW example, if you stick me in a room and say, how many would you like to have? I'm going to say 1, and there's a gap. But then if you later interview me and you say like, well, why don't you have this one? You said you wanted this one. Well, then I would probably tell you, well, actually, I could probably afford it, but I'd have to give up all these other things. In fact, maybe my kids wouldn't go to the school that I like to send them. Maybe we would have to eat rice and beans all the time. I'd have to cancel my Netflix subscription. I'd have to list out all the things that would get that a car payment like that would compete with, right? And so what I'm getting at is the idea that people's preferences or what they say that they want are different when we think about constraints of reality, right? You have to pay for them, and everything is to be paid for. So, there's something kind of idiotic actually about kind of wandering around surveying people about what they'd like to have in the absence of proposing the trade-offs, right? Because the answer is always like, well, as what compared to what, right? So would you like to have one more BMW compared to not having all these other nice things that you have? And so we would say, well, this is kind of like a realistic type of measure of demand or so I'm kind of showing up to the discussion here and saying, wait a minute, look, I don't know why we should treat intentions about family size as different from all other types of things, which is that people have kind of abstract like measures of things that they think would be ideal to have if they didn't have to pay for them. And then they have kind of what we would maybe call a revealed preference. So after they've faced all the life choices and trade-offs that life presents them, like how many BMWs do they have? And for me, it's 0, right? So like, is that something we need to build a public policy around? Probably not. Now, I'm being flippant. Of course, children are more important to human life than BMWs. But if we can't solve the question of how much people want children in the presence of trade-offs, then our policy aimed at addressing something like a fertility gap is definitely going to be off the rails. And that's the reason to bring this up.
So we see a lot of interest in what's called pronatalism. And a pronatalism has kind of like 2 sides to it, right? There's the side that's more about trying to get policies out of the way of family formation and childbearing. And then there's like a weird side to it, right? A side that's like the wrong people are having too few children. How much of this have you had to navigate as an issue?
Yeah. Not too much, although occasionally I've been in a place, the debate or discussion, I would say, that I had with Ross Dathett and Tim Carney. I was asked about, what my, how I would describe myself as a pronatalist. And I kind of said, wait a second, I'm not actually sure I describe myself as a pronatalist. And I'm still sort of going to plead the fifth on that. I don't know if I'm a pronatalist. But that's because it depends what we mean by pronatalism, right? And so how much have I had to navigate? Thankfully, not that much so far, but that's because I've tended to be pretty clear. There's a very kind of creepy side to pronatalism that, let's be frank, has been attached in the past to eugenics. I mean, now that's a word nobody likes, but obviously this the origin, we'll say, of Planned Parenthood is really connected to this idea that we could select out who are the right people to be born, right? And so some of the bad forms of pronatalism that we've seen in the past, have babies for the Fuhrer, have babies for the country, the Reich. I mean, obviously our mind goes to these cases. There are fewer of these cases that we know of in public policy than these, let's say, contra cases, like a Chinese one-child policy, which aims to limit. But I think they're really offensive on the same kind of level, right? And this is why I'm concerned about the thought that we would want to admit that the state should be targeting birth rates. So certainly today, when we think of, meaning if it's okay to target a higher birth rate, why isn't it okay for a state to target a lower birth rate? right? So in other words, the state then would choose, I take it, the idea is the state should choose a target that's in the interests of, we'll say, the common good. However, the state reads the sense of things. And let's be clear, today, lots and lots of people still believe that we have too many children. And so I certainly imagine that some global elites and some other types of world leaders may be interested in targeting a lower birth rate than we have now, for the sake of the planet, at least, right? Let's be clear. So some of this pronatalism on the darker side, the side I'm certainly I would be loath to be connected with, I think involves a move, which I think is an unethical move, which is that the state could know what the ideal number of children for the common good would be, and then could make that number a target of policy. I think that's unethical and something that we should resist.
Yeah, there's an outstanding book that came out a few years ago by Thomas Leonard called Illiberal Reformers.
Yes.
And he actually speaks to these problems you've been describing.
Yeah.
There's this one guy, his name is something Ross. I actually assigned this in a class because it really does illustrate the eugenic frame of mind, where he describes the need to establish a minimum wage so that people would prefer to hire Anglo-Saxon Americans over immigrants, and the result of the policy would be to starve out immigrants so that they would have and that Anglo-Saxons would make enough money to have enough children.
Right.
That's not what that's been a weird thing that has shown up, and I asked that just to kind of clear the air, because this happens to be something that I've seen surface. One from me, and then we'll see what Tom's got. You and I travel in Newman Guide Catholic circles, so we have some degree of insulation from a broader culture on a day-to-day basis, but there's a lot of discussion of what you might call the kind of contraceptive assumption, in which heterosexual couples together, married or not married, sort of, if they're going to have a child, it's considered something that they volunteer to do, because the assumption is that at any other given time they're engaging in contraception. And so is this mindset something that has kind of affected the way people approach children as a kind of luxury good, or as a kind of lifestyle choice? And correspondingly, if you make these decisions and then you struggle financially, this sort of leaves them and kind of like, well, no one told you to have this kid. There's this kind of callousness that surfaces among friends and family.
Yeah. So I think that callousness that results, that I think you've described it well, from the sense that like children are really opt-in, they're kind of a lifestyle choice. That callousness, we could lump that in with a kind of anti-natalism. I think it's easier to describe facets of antinatalism than to describe what a healthy pronatalism would look like, right? So I think that definitely, that's definitely one of the we say downstream effects. I like to say that this is like what happened with the contraceptive revolution. I think it's good to sort of think about the contraceptive revolution as every bit as consequential for both economics and politics as the Industrial Revolution. And I mean, and heck, like we're still not done unpacking what we think the effects of the Industrial Revolution have been. In other words, like I would say,
some have argued that the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race.
Well, exactly. I was going to say, we're not even convinced that the Industrial Revolution was good. I think like this is kind of where we're at. And of course, I think the truth is that, few aspects of human progress are kind of lack downsides, right? I mean, but in any case, we're still trying to figure out if the Industrial Revolution was good. And one of the things I'm interested in pushing into the discussion precisely about the Industrial Revolution is that the contraceptive revolution marks a similar kind of landmark change in the way human beings organize their economic life, right? Not just their sort of family life, but their economic life. If you're looking for the major inflection point for when married mothers enter the workforce, it's 1960. And that's the major inflection, but this is a tremendous change. So, initially in fact, I would say most people, I would say on the left and the right, think of the contraceptive revolution as, in a sense, an unadulterated good. So like we're still adjudicating about the Industrial Revolution, but like we either skip over, we don't raise hard questions about the contraceptive revolution. And some of my more technical work in economics has pointed out, like, well, there's been some downsides. It looked like in economic terms, it was good for college educated women who got more degrees and did more work and made more money. But it also came along with, say, a greater chance that women whose fathers didn't finish college or didn't even go to college would end up pregnant without a partner. So that looks like maybe a downside. So yeah, so this is this major revolution that takes place. And I think in demographic terms, the simplest way I've heard it put, something I read a long time before I wrote this book, and I really thought it was stunning, was just this sense that kind of what it does to marriage and to childbearing is something like this. Once you have really effective reversible birth control, which, okay, we mean the pill, what it did to marriage was it changed the contraceptive expectation for couples. And let's be clear, people worried about the size of their families before the pill. For sure they did. If they didn't, we wouldn't have all of these interesting statements by pastors and theologians back in the 1920s and the 1930s. But what was happening in those days was, well, thanks to modern medicine, more of your children were going to live. And that looked like that could be a huge burden to couples, especially working class families. And so the expectation was kind of like, you got married, you had a few kids, kids came, they started to come because there's this expectation. It's not opt-in, it's just part of being married. And then maybe there's a question to be had. Couples look at each other, they look at their situation, they go, when do we try to stop? Or when do we put this on hold for a little while? And that was kind of the picture of things. That was the basic demographic picture, was you had some kids and then you figured out if you needed to sort of slow things down. And people did all kinds of things to slow things down. With the advent of the pill, which is really effective and obviously reversible, the change that took place was, instead of that you got married, and this is of course true today, you get married and then you're contracepting because that's the normal expectation. And then you have to decide separately, there's a new decision to make when you're ready to have your first kid. And you hear this everywhere. It's all over the place. I mean, it's just the normal thing. And so what that does is, as you point out, makes children opt in. The expectation is people are not welcoming children until there's but then the second thing, and I think this is critical and really interesting, is if it's not a kind of expected default behavior, it's something you have to choose on its own terms, right? I'm not just choosing marriage and to be partnered up, which is obviously a thing everybody wants. Now I have to choose the kid on its own terms, a separate choice. And what it does, we do the thing we do every time we choose anything, is we ask, like, well, what are the conditions for this choice? What's the right number of kids? What's the right time to have a kid? And we're seeing a kind of ratcheting up of the things that you need to have. So I've been recently informed by Stephanie Murray, who's doing some great pieces in the Atlantic, that, couples today think you have to have a separate bedroom for each kid. And, right. So I'm like, wow, okay. The first time I had only one roommate was when I went to college, So this is wild. Or couples that, and that's not that these things can't be, corrected in the popular image. But I mean, certainly when our grandparents were having children, they didn't sit around and think, well, until I have, enough bedrooms for every kid to have their own room, I can't have this kid. So what's happened is it's an opt-in situation. You choose it just like you choose anything else. When's the right time to buy a car? When's the right time to make this move? When's the right time to, upgrade the dishwasher? And so that means that we do what we do with all human decisions. It's a sort of we subject children to all of these conditions, right? And as soon as I put it that way, we subject children to all these conditions, it starts to sound an awful lot like the kind of mistakes of the eugenicists and the family planners. Who's the right conditions? Who's the right people to have children? So I've increasingly become convinced that part of the hellscape we're living in now is this this logic across the board when we think about children that asks us to think about the conditions for life to be good or meaningful or desirable. So placing conditions on the desirability of human life. So that is essentially something that the technology of the pill brought to us. We're not going back. That's not going away. And I'm not sure we should wish it away, right? Why do I say that? Well, because I don't think we should wish to be in a condition where we're not aware of the meaning of our fertility. We're not aware when a child could be conceived, right? So to all the, religious people who think the pill is an immoral thing to use, I'm actually trying to sort of advocate for sort of like, what would we prefer to see? A world in which we have no idea when we're going to conceive our children? So actually, I don't think that that's, we could unpack that more. But I think what we're basically living in is a time when we have not fully appreciated this, is a time when children have to be chosen for their own sake.
Mhm.
And that means there has to be a case for their own sake, right?
Yeah.
And then layer on top of that they're not needed. You do not need to have children to flourish in this society. And that's a huge change. That's something that occurs before 1960. And that's, really just a byproduct of our wealth and our success, largely, right? I mean, I don't need to have 5 kids so that I don't have to go to the well, 8 times a day. Right? There are many reasons why, if you live in poverty, having extra hands around the house is a great thing. And we don't need that anymore. And furthermore, we don't need children to support us in our old age, right? We've got New Deal programs for that. We've got state pensions. And, if I'm successful enough, I can save enough.
For now. We have those
For now,
programs.
we have these programs, exactly. And so the kids aren't needed. Like, so no one's going to get married and think, well, man, if I don't have 5 kids really fast, we're going to be living a really uncomfortable life where you're going to have to tend the cows and I'm going to have to tend the horses. And like, I don't want to do that. I'd rather have a 10-year-old who's going to milk the cows. That went away. And that's probably a good thing that it went away. So then we're just sort of left with this naked choice, like our kids worth choosing for their own sakes. Okay, like, so that puts us in a really awkward place. We have to talk about that. So that was, something that comes out of the book, of course, which is really interesting. All kinds of reasons to choose children for their own sakes. But I mean, that's not a normal kind of way to argue in this kind of pronatalist universe. We are not even asking the question of whether children are desirable. We're helping ourselves to that. We're kind of assuming people will see children as desirable for their own sakes, or that they already do. And I'm just not sure that that's true.
So just to clarify for the audience then, so you're trying to strike a balance here because you don't want family central planning. But you do want to counter misinformation or misunderstandings about the value for the world of having more children versus having fewer children as well, right?
Yeah.
So you want to counter sort of the alarmism against overpopulation, because that can be a problem and it's unnecessary problem, right? So part of your work is also showing how children are a blessing, even from the macro scale. Get out of this mentality that you're doing harm to the society by having children. What are some important arguments then for that children are an economic blessing or are a blessing for a country? I mean, you shouldn't be afraid of it, at least.
Yeah. Okay. So this is really an interesting question. I expect that maybe, James, maybe you were alluding to this a minute ago, sort of like, for now we have these New Deal programs. I think this is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
But actually not having children is going to like bring the end of the New Deal programs, because I don't think we should be alarmist about it. We cannot pay for these things. These New Deal programs depended upon a growing population. We're already facing a shrinking working age population. So yeah, they're going to dry up whether or not we're cheerleaders or not for them. And
we just need to stop funding foreign wars, Catherine. That'll definitely cover the losses from
that's right.
lowering the ratio of worker to retiree.
That'll be the write-off. Yeah. Yeah. So did I get off your question, Thomas? What was your actual?
What
you want me to talk about?
I think it's just, I think all of us are very clear on why,
Yeah.
yeah, children are actually a good thing.
Why
You
they're a
were saying
blessing.
how that they
Yeah.
will, because
Oh,
we have this problem of a demographic problem with our New Deal
yeah.
programs like Social Security
Okay.
and Medicare.
Yeah. No, that's
And
right.
what are some other benefits, like from economic standpoint, in addition to that? Like, what are some of the
Yeah.
arguments would that sort of settle their concerns that it's going to lead to greater resource consumption or all these?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that embedded in the work that I did, and in some sense a backdrop, are these I think really sound economic arguments about resource consumption.
Mhm.
And we would want to point to the work of Julian Simon here, who's kind of like the GOAT on this point, but sorely neglected.
Greatest of all time for
Yeah.
the elderly listeners. That's what GOAT stands for.
He's-
She wasn't calling him a rascal.
All right, thank you.
Reference.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know how online our listeners are, but yeah,
Think
Julian
Simone
Simon
Biles, the
is
GOAT.
tremendous. I mean, so he's a guy who sort of shows up and says, look, I mean, Thomas Malthus is an alarmist, and he thinks there's going to be overpopulation. We're going to cycle through, famine and disease and destruction if we have more kids. And he thinks people should get married later and later. Of course, Malthus, has all kind of quirky views, but but then you can go through the eugenicists who were in their own way worried about overpopulation of the wrong type of people. And if they're so explicit about it, right? They're so explicit, it's reprehensible. And then you fast forward to someone like Paul Ehrlich and, all of the swirling concerns about overpopulation in the 60s and the 70s. And it really persisted, certainly throughout most of my childhood and young adulthood. I can give you terrible examples of that. But, so Julian Simon is, he starts out his career as a young economist, and he kind of is on board with all of that stuff. And then he starts to look more closely and basically says, look, every time these guys show up to say that we're going to overpopulate, they're always wrong. But why are they wrong? Like, what happens with resources and people? And I think there's kind of two parts to his answer, and they're not hard to restate. And the first part is sort of that we're not the same as rabbits. Like we're not like an animal, a mere animal. We don't reproduce like without thinking. And so what happens there is we want to think about human creativity, ingenuity, knowledge of local conditions, right? And so in fact, it turns out that people don't just sort of reproduce up to the limit of their resources available. They don't. And then, so that's the first point, which is a kind of assertion about the importance of the human animal as a different kind of an animal. And then the second part is a little bit of an explanation of this mechanism. How does it work? Well, when you have more people present, these are population pressures. They bid up there's demand. They bid up the price of scarce resources. That higher price induces people who could bring more supply to the table, either bring the same kind of good that might be needed, could be water, could be food, to bring those things to the table, or in some cases to bring some kind of innovative substitute, right? The price is high, so I think, okay, hey, there's a living to be made in bringing this to the market, and then that increased supply brings the price pressure down, and you end up, after that initial pressure, that higher price pressure, you end up with more of the kind of resource that you needed in the first place. And Simon goes through all kinds of good, I mean, it's a really boring part of his work where he goes through the history of the price of these various resources, all the metals, all the foods, the use of land. I mean, he basically says, I know it's counterintuitive, but it turns out that the more people there are, the cheaper resources become, and the more abundant they become, which is really kind of shocking and counterintuitive, right? So, I mean, so this is the sense, I think maybe the best way to answer your question about why it is that sort of from an economic perspective, children are a blessing, right? Because even for a household, we know like that extra kid, initially you go like, how am I going to provide? But what happens is you do what? You look at each other, you go, okay, one of us is going to be a little bit more productive. And then, at the same time, I think people who are used to observing the workings of providence, they go, oh, well, we're killing it. We're working as hard as we can. We're really pushed to the limit. That's probably good for me. But then you see these things that occur that you say, well, but wow, this was kind of an unexpected blessing. My neighbor got rid of his car and didn't need it anymore, or whatever. These sorts of things do happen. And in the lives of we'll say, spiritually aware people, they discover these kinds of blessings. It would not be fair not to say this is what religious people call providence. And so you've got these twin mechanisms that are going on. One is the mechanism, I'll say, of like human rationality and participation in the economy, which says, okay, look, having more children arrive in a certain place, having more people arrive in a certain place, counterintuitively creates pressures that leads to more ingenuity, more creativity, and more abundance. That's the first things, like this human rationality built into us. It looks like what always happens. And then the second piece is you kind of pay attention for the ways in which there are, it will say, provision of providence. And, for spiritually aware people, you observe it, you see it as a kind of gratitude for those gifts of providence. And they can happen, of course, at the scale of communities as well as individual families. And this is the reason why together, I would say, that apart and aside from the transcendent and spiritual value of children, it's possible to sort of trace out a pretty clear logic about the economic benefits of we'll just say being open to having more children. And I'm always want to emphasize this kind of sense of openness and participation with God's providence.
Very good. Thank you.
So what do you think of policy proposals that we hear from post-liberal advocates like Gladden Pappin has been touting a lot of Hungarian policy measures to encourage family? They haven't really worked. So I guess maybe you would probably not like them because you don't like policies that don't work. But why do you think maybe they're not working? And maybe the policy needs to be tweaked in a way to make it work? Or do you not think they can work at all?
Yeah. So given what's just been said, I think there's theoretical reasons why they are not likely to work. Really quickly, they haven't worked as pronatalism. I always want to sort of specify there are many reasons why a government or a policymaker may want to give benefits to families. And I think some of them may be reduced to a clear type of pronatalism, and Hungary's been really clear about that. But others of them may not be, specifically pronatalist. So if they're pronatalist policies for the sake of raising the birth rate, they can be judged whether the birth rate is meaningfully raised. And we don't have any real examples of birth rates responding in a meaningful way to benefits and subsidies and transfers. So on those grounds, I think they're to be, we'll say, we should be skeptical of them. All right, but one of the other things I think is going on in this discussion of pronatalism is I think what a lot of people have in mind. When you press people, of course, they say, well, no, I don't really want to bribe people into having babies. And that's not like a good approach. And by the way, I'll just bracket for the future that a lot of this, to some extent, post-liberal, and to some other extent, kind of like, just we'll say, coalescing of interests and authoritarian means to strengthen families. And a lot of this stuff, I'll just bracket this and leave it right there. But a lot of it is really coming from a very sort of online male perspective. So I think women tend to be a lot more skeptical, we'll say, of the idea that kind of like a few extra $1,000 here or there is going to cause me to want to rearrange my life, rearrange my body, go through like all the sleepless nights, right? So this is sort of the second stage of, I think, a kind of criticism is like, on what margin do you think you can incentivize childbearing? And I think one of the concerns I have is that we're thinking about it the way we're thinking about like incentivizing people not to buy big gulps at 7-Eleven. So the goal is like, well, we don't want you to consume like 4,000 grams of sugar. We want to encourage you instead to choose the drink with 2,000 grams of sugar. And so we're not actually asking for something that's a really enormous sacrifice. It's so the margin of the incentive, we tax the hell out of this drink and we try to get you to buy this drink instead. Probably that kind of incentive works. And, I think there's a lot of incentivizing we've done with this kind of, we could call them sin taxes or the kinds of taxes designed to sort of push consumption in different directions. But is having a kid that kind of a thing, right? So I think like, obviously it's not, it's not that kind of a thing, right? So you want me to, choose to have the next kid over whatever else I had planned. And this is like a fundamentally like a, it's a lifetime commitment. It doesn't go away. It doesn't really even go away after 18 years, right? We all know this. So the mere thought that sort of, I think incentives matter, but they'd have to be enormously big and totally offensive, by the way, right? Like the state would have to be saying, well, how about $1 million? Like, $1 million. I mean, Lyman Stone will say $500,000. He'll say, look, for $500,000, you could get people to have kids. He's probably right about that, but isn't that like enormously offensive? Like we would think about setting up a state, never mind that none of the states that have a baby bust problem, which is pretty much everybody.
Could you imagine going to your son and saying,
yeah,
you're my in-ground pool?
I know, totally. Exactly. And none of these states have the resources to ante up, $500,000 payments per kid. Like that's insane. Every one of these countries is going bankrupt in part because of our unwillingness to have children. The last thing I'll say, which maybe would be useful to think about it, is something I want to sort of eject into this family policy debate, is sort of like, are there ways the state is already anti-natal or anti-family in ways we're not discussing, right? So as much as I don't think the state can or should aim at a particular household family size, I think that's offensive. I think it's unethical. I think it's dangerous, right? It always leads to unintended consequences. I definitely don't think states should try to get in the way, right? I don't think states should like kneecap you at the beginning. So you could do that. Okay, so what's going on with family policy? And I'll just say in a really simple way that we have a really large unexamined commitment in all of, we'll say, the Christian democratic West, all of the, we'll say social democratic West. And I very much include the United States in this description. And that unexamined assumption is that we should essentially tax functional families to pay for and support the needs of dysfunctional families. All right. Now, what I just said could sound very offensive. It could sound like I'm wading into the same kind of, who's the right people to have kids. I was saying, and I want to be very clear, I'm not doing that at all. But logically speaking, if you're going to have a large welfare state, and we have one, you have to tax people whose lives are working. You have to tax people who have managed to get up in the morning, who managed to, finish their education, who managed to make sound life choices, by and large, who managed to get married and raise children. You have to tax those people to provide benefits for the people who are, slipping through the cracks. That's what a safety net system functionally does. The unexamined question here is whether or not the nature fundamentally of the welfare state, which we've again all adopted at various levels. Okay, we're not France yet, but we're up there. Whether or not that fundamental system, right? My 20-year-old son and his 20-year-old wife and their 6-month-old baby, they're paying a significant chunk of their taxes. And where are those taxes going? They're going to support the needs of people who haven't managed to do all of those things. Okay, I'm not saying, let me make it very clear, I'm not saying we shouldn't help people who are stuck in that situation, but whether that kind of help should come from a structural welfare state is, I think, something we have not examined. So it's possible that our entire commitment to the welfare state is kneecapping and handicapping, family formation in all kinds of ways. At the moment, we'll just say, it's not like what I'm just saying is like, no one's ever said that before. What I'm saying is that I don't think we're done settling the debate about, we'll call it, zombie Reaganism, or, I mean, kind of there were plenty of people making the critique that I'm making in the 1980s and the 1990s. One of the features of the post-liberals is that they've taken the position that the argument I just made is obviously incorrect, that obviously we weren't doing enough to help people. I don't think that's at all clear. And if you look at all sort of aspects of what occurred under Reagan, you can take the view, which they do, that there was too much freedom. That what characterized the Reagan era was sort of a commitment to unfettered liberalism. But some of us, for a very long time, have taken the view that whatever the rhetoric of some corners of the right in those days, government and the welfare state grew in all kinds of ways through that time, and that the alternative and clearly minority hypothesis on the right today, which I think I occupy to some extent, is that we didn't see in the 1980s, in fact, anything like the kind of loosening of these structures of political economy, which may have been hampering the ability of functional families to grow, to expand, and to set themselves in a good economic footing. So I'm kind of showing up to say, like, I think we still need to examine this. I mean, it hasn't been going very well for us. Yeah, so that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
No Hewlett Foundation grant for you.
No, I am definitely off the good girl list. I'm not on the good girl list yet. Yeah, so I don't know what to call that. This critique is something that I don't think has been made well. I mean, Charles Murray made it. Did he make the argument well? I doubt it. There's some, I think, significant limitations of the way that Murray argues and has argued. But I'd like to borrow a phrase from Abigail Schreyer's work, which I think is just tremendous. And she's opening our eyes to a lot of ways we're kind of off the rails as parents today. And that's this kind of term of iatrogenic harm, that in the name of helping, you can do harm. And until her recent book, I think that was a word that a lot of people hadn't heard before.
What's the term again?
Iatrogenic.
Iatrogenic.
IAT. It probably has some fancy Greek origin that I don't know. And if my husband were on,
Michael, get Michael in the case.
Iatros. So iatrogenic harm. In fact, I looked it up, and now, of course, I can't remember it. But the idea is that, yeah, you could, ultimately, your intentions aren't the way you can judge the quality of your work. And I mean this in terms of like medicine, right? A therapist will say, this is to speak to her book. A therapist may want to help, but merely by engaging in the therapeutic exercises, if it's not really needed, it could create a kind of dependence and a kind of perpetuates a myth that the person cannot develop as a strong and independent decision maker and functioning adult. This is her claim. So, right. So you say, well, whatever these therapists want to be doing, they may be very well meaning, they might want to help, but in fact, it's possible that help can hurt. And so I'm really thankful to Abigail Schreyer for helping us to remember that this can happen. Now, the term iatrogenic harm has been used in medicine before. I mean, there are times when, like lobotomies, like you have good intentions. You think like maybe removing part of the brain is gonna help out. But we discover that a lot of these things ultimately, whatever the intentions of the medical provider, actually harmed and didn't hurt. And I think we need to start using this language of iatrogenic when we think about policy, that a lot of policies have to be judged by their outcomes and not by their intentions.
So let's go back to what you bracketed.
Yeah.
Because you're not the first person to, my wife, Julia, was like, what? Because, I don't want you to speculate on the kind of inner workings of the average college educated affluent white male post-liberal, or as we call them, post-liberals. But what do you think is going on with that anthropology, that they think that what really needs to be done is to do a handover of cash? Like, what does that tell you?
Gosh, the handover. I mean, you're lending your language is lending itself to all kinds of I think like unhealthy jokes I could make right now. I'm
not stopping you.
You're not going to stop me. Look, I mean, the basic. Here's the problem, I think, on some level, is that if somebody like me or someone like Jen Frey or any other sort of female person wants to enter this discussion and say, look, like it's totally offensive that you think you could sort of just bribe like women into having babies. Like, this is ridiculous. Well, I think the problem is that the people who've been screaming about female agency and kind of rights and everything for a long time are oftentimes people that we would be ill-advised to model ourselves after, let's say. I have dubbed myself the Judith Butler palate cleanse on my Twitter bio. And I hope that could be true. If you really just need a chaser after you read Judith Butler.
Well, I can tell you, I've read your work and it makes sense. So that is to the extent that Judith Butler
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
so
won't finish the thought.
No, finish the thought. No, so here's the thought is that, you know, it sounds like a really feminist thing to be just, you know, in the worst possible way to be saying, look, like, this is, you know, having a baby is something that deeply affects the female part of the couple in a way that's like asymmetrically difficult. Now, number one, I think it's important not to, so first of all, I think that's true. But also I don't think it's true in the way that it's typically meant. So it's typically meant like, oh, look, okay, having a baby, you want women, like you're forcing women to have babies when you outlaw abortion, for instance, right? You know, no, like nobody's forcing anybody to get pregnant. That decision got made, you know, part and aside. But, you know, are we ready to say that because a bunch of people who have an irrational attachment to kind of like bodily autonomy and women's rights in a way that has denied the humanity of the unborn child, that because of that group of bad people, we're sort of, it's like, it's okay to just gloss over the fact that couples make this decision correctly in the privacy of their marriage, that physically at least, and professionally and socially, I'm trying to be very careful, physically and professionally and socially, the decision to have a child falls heavier on a lady, on a woman. What I mean there is like, of course, I'm well aware and deeply respectful of the fact that by nature in a good marriage, you know, that decision will fall heavily on the breadwinner, which will be typically majority of the time will be typically a man. So I don't want to like just remove the guys from the picture. They have to prayerfully consider this. But this idea that we should, I don't know, maybe just we could carry on this policy incentive, hand people cash conversation without asking what are the things that women are thinking about when they're deciding to be open to having another child. So it sounds like, in a way, like a really feminist operation to undertake. But you know, I don't care. I think that it's a true operation. It's a thing we have to do. And as I recently posted on Twitter got a lot of attention, but it's something so simple to say it, right? Like every week I get emails from young women who are in college who say, you know, I'd like to have a big family. I'd like to stay home with them. I really value children, but I also want to like use my talents and, I don't know, help people and become a doctor, a lawyer, or I'm interested in politics. And I'm worried that these two things are in conflict. You go, yeah, I get it. I see why you're worried. They are in conflict in a pretty deep way. So what I'm kind of here to say is that we when we think about just handing people lots of cash or even a little bit of cash for the sake of raising the birth rate, we're kind of skipping over this question that like young women are starting out life with multiple good things in front of them, and they have to make that decision. Of course, they're going to make that decision together with their partners, their husbands, if that's of course the correct thing. But like, what is that supposed to look like? You know, daddy comes home and says, hey, well, you know, honey, child tax credit got raised. Like, let's do this. You know, like, that's ridiculous. Right? That's absurd, right? You know, my husband cares deeply about my professional development. And I think, you know, most Christian good husbands do. And so that's really where this debate has to, it certainly has to engage this. I just think that if policymakers want to skip over that part, you know, mostly these guys, mostly the guys, it's a mistake. So I don't know if that puts me in the feminist camp. It probably doesn't. I've tried to not take a side in the in the discussions about feminism. But certainly if it means that I have to be identified as some kind of feminist in order to say women's agency has to be taken into consideration, and these two very important and good options we've placed in front of women with, you know, women's liberation, so to speak, we'll use those words. Like, are we ready to just erase that? I don't think we are. I don't think we should. And I don't think we have to. So, you know, part of the exercise of my work is to say, we shouldn't demonize too much. Because I get this, by the way, I get this in emails. We shouldn't demonize women's education. What we have to be worried about is what the values are. So it's not education that's the problem, it's the values. And we know, like, right, that education is the path through which, it's besides your family, it's the way you're going to develop your values.
So you've been very forward about the need for a kind of religious frame, as well as that religious frame being Christian.
Yeah.
Do you think that's really what's necessary here? A kind of revival, maybe not like of the old style Methodist tent revivals, but what would,
Right.
is that what
Yeah.
it would really take, is a kind
Yeah.
of change? And do you think there may be also state obstacles to such a revival?
Yeah. I think that's what's required. I do. Why do I think that? Because the longer I've been studying the problem, the more convinced I am that that we'll say humanity's approach to children unaided by grace or faith, we'll say. And I also want to say, I would like to say biblical faith. I'd like to include our Jewish brothers and sisters in this. Would not like to exclude them from the vision. I think would lend itself to a revival. But I think that kind of humanity unaided by faith or by grace, and I've thought a lot about this looking back in time, I think always tends to subordinate the choice about children to various adult values. And what do I mean by that? I mean that so long as children are useful to the household, good, we have them. So long as they're useful to something else, we have them, right? So as long as kids are useful, we have them. And they're useful to what? To this, to that, to wealth, to power, to whatever else. Okay, so that might sound really hilarious to us today, because like, who could think that kids were valuable from the perspective of wealth or power? Well, if you lived in a time when kids died frequently and it was understood more clearly that you had to have a growing population to sort of maybe supply your army, like we are so abstracted from the things that concern people in the past before technology. So 100% kids could have been valued for the sake of the wealth that they brought, for the sake of the power that they might have enabled a state to have, military follies, we'll say. And so that when we look back, we can gloss over that and romanticize the human race and think, well, people used to value kids for their own sake, and now they don't. And I'm becoming increasingly persuaded that we never did, simpliciter, that where you find children valued for their own sake tends to sort of be in these places where there are religious revivals based in some kind of biblical faith. Why do I say biblical faith? Well, obviously, right? If you want to find a text that really most clearly from the first pages to the last makes it clear that children are to be desired for their own sakes, that God desires us to have children, and that children and the children are deeply connected to the salvation of the world, right? I could not put that in any other way than I just put it. So I'm actually persuaded that that the standard default position for the human race is if children aren't useful, we're not really that interested in them. And so I think today there's a kind of usefulness that children can supply, which is the experience of being a parent. Like many people would like to experience being a parent. And so that's a kind of usefulness. And even there, it's not a pure, like, I want this kid for the kid's sake, right? It's when you have that seventh kid that like, clearly you've been a parent. You already know what that's like, right? So that's why I wanted to know what would get you to go from 6 to 7. It's not the experience, right? It's not the wealth in today's society. What is that? And that the nugget of the answer turns out to be this kid is worth existing, right? It's valuable for his or her own sake. So I don't see how we could change the default position of mankind. If I'm right, so I get that I'm telling a story that not everybody's kind of bought into yet. If I'm right, then we are up against not just sort of like today's technologies or our political economy or like our bad policies. We're probably up against something which is deeper. Look, I mean, you could find all kinds of people who have questioned whether it's good to have children explicitly, apart and aside from this kind of devaluing of children in relation to their usefulness. The Gnostics weren't sure we should have kids. These groups of people are always popping up. We talked about Malthus, we talked about Ehrlich. These are all, in my current thinking, variations on a theme, and that theme is children get to come and join the party as long as they're bringing something that we need. So if that's the picture of mankind, if I'm right about that, then I don't think we fix this without a kind of evangelization or spreading of living religious communities. Okay, can the state help with that? I do think the state can help, because I think, first of all, the state could ask itself to what extent it fosters. And this starts to sound like kind of old-fashioned stuff a little bit, like, well, what would a country look like if it committed itself very deeply to religious pluralism and to religious toleration? Like, gee, I wish we had some historical record of some country that sort of thought of itself as totally 100% committed to this as like a first principle. Right? And I'm describing us in the past. I think we are clearly not like top line committed today to kind of religious pluralism and religious toleration and putting other types of goods at the service of that. So yeah, I think we need to consider very deeply the way in which modern states tend to view churches and living religious communities as threats and not as like we'll say the fundamental stuff, which generates all this social capital that you want. You want all that social capital because we all know it's good to live in Utah. They have a lot of social capital. Can you get that social capital in Utah without the Mormon Church? I doubt it. Right? It's almost ridiculous to think that just because it's a beautiful spot, they built up all this social capital. So we've got all this weird language like social capital. We can thank our sort of like Quaker sociologist Bob Putnam for this, but what did we do there? We just, it's like we said, we gave it a name, but we really mean the Mormon Church. Mm-hmm. We don't actually mean freaking social capital. We mean the Mormon Church. And so I think this is our project today, is to start like, oh, can we just go out and get social capital? We could buy it or, invest in it, right? Like, can we do these things without the church? How necessary is the church? And I think my own thought is I'm becoming more deeply convinced that we've just helped ourselves to the contributions of churches and religious people in this country. I mean, I think one of my favorites, which I've been inspired by your work, James, is, like the extent to which religious persons really drove forward the civil rights movement in this country. Like as if this was some kind of like, human awakening where just, people everywhere just decided this was important. No, like if you look back, you find out actually it's like very specific persons with very deep religious commitments and a zeal for the fact that these kind of human rights abuses against our minority population offend God deeply. And because it offends God deeply, I am going to go out and I'm going to commit civil disobedience. I'm going to do these things. So can we reimagine the civil rights movement without the participation of churches? I doubt it. So that's kind of what I largely mean. And now we're facing an existential crisis of another type. And I don't mean we should be policy alarmists here. I think we should be realists. It is an existential crisis. And can we solve it without cultivating, committing ourselves as a top level principle again to religious pluralism and tolerance and what that would mean would be putting certain collective goods perhaps on the back burner and elevating the value of, okay, that religious community, they do weird stuff. All right, well, that's all right. We're gonna accept those weird things in order to have the goods that these religious communities bring that we don't know how to buy because we don't know how to buy them, right? Mm-hmm. We'd like people to have more kids. Well, there's one really awesome way to make that happen. People become very convinced that God desires this, that he will provide if we have children, that children are a way of expressing our hope in the future, a way of bringing divine goodness to the world. We need more of that. We need more people who freely choose that. Wouldn't it be great if there were institutions that that's their whole shtick, like that's what they do, right? And we, meanwhile, we're like, oh, you are opposed to contraception, you can't operate. Oh, you don't agree that, two guys can't be married. Well, you can't do adoption services. Oh, you don't like, so we have just boxed churches into this ridiculous space and said, now we want you to shape people's values, but we don't want you to meet anybody's needs. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's fundamentally like a retrograde position, but I think that's the position that we're in.
So it sounds like to me, that's awesome. Everything you said was awesome, but so it sounds to me then that you're open to a sort of a fusionist approach to family policy, where you use libertarian means for social conservative ends, in the sense that you try to get the state out of the way in all the ways that it has currently been undermining these efforts. So it sounds like you could be very valuable to all these family policy people to help them produce better policy proposals to get the ends that they want.
I mean, if if the question is, can I agree with our post-liberal friends or other pro-family constituents, maybe like some of the NatCons, excuse me. If the question is, do I agree with them that these are desirable ends, 100%, 1,000%, we should all be asking the question, to what extent are the political and economic structures of our time, are they sufficient to allow for young families to be optimistic, love children, form families, and do those things? 100%. Do I think these are the kinds of things that policymakers should have in mind? 100%. But where I would maybe disagree with friends and some of the other, maybe we'll just say people who are sort of maybe more optimistic about authoritarian types of policy measures, where I disagree is that that we can get the job done by being kind of idiots about civil society. And I think this is where I think certainly you invoke fusionism. I think one of the best, at its best, fusionism is one that we see the state as fundamentally limited, not because it's good to limit it, because we like freedom, like they won't tread on me, right? But rather it's limited in a kind of capacity, since it's just incapable. Why is it incapable? Because the state doesn't actually give people the drive to have children. It can protect it, and it can aim to protect the spaces in which these things can flourish. And I think this is important. Maybe, I know I never want to characterize all libertarians together, because like you just talk to 3 libertarians, you have 10 different positions. But certainly a kind of libertarianism or policy minimalism that would say the state will not even intervene to protect religious groups. I would think that would be something we'd have to be worried about. So I'm certainly not there should never be any government or never, great, that's not my position. But when I said idiots about civil society, here's what I mean. We cannot do policy analysis without an understanding of how society works, right? Like, what is the beginning, right? What is the beginning of human society, right? So either the beginning of the human society is these like free unattached adults who are kind of floating around like a primordial soup, and somebody draws a circle around them and says, you belong to this country. Or the primary thing, the basic beginning is, a man and his wife and his children. That's a society already. And then that man and his wife and his children, they partner up with another man and wife and children, because they don't want to have to keep watch all night over the campfire, right? That's really exhausting. And maybe you could have 5 or 6 more families, would reduce the burden. So we build up a picture of how civil society works by thinking about what's a character of human life. And so if that's what a fusionism means, or a good type of fusionism means, I definitely think that's correct.
Yeah, I should just clarify. I should clarify, I'm not a libertarian. But no. I think I could say a classical liberal means too. Yeah, right. So it seems to me, though, that you did give some examples, though, where it would be, you could have policy, proposals, like
I do think so.
This idea of contraceptive mandates without any exceptions for the religious people, or like what happened with the Little Sisters of the Poor and Hobby Lobby and all of that. So that's a case where it really heavy-handed paternalism from the standpoint of progressives is actually undermining some of these goals. And then at the level of education, the sort of top-down Department of Education, public schooling arrangement, as opposed to more educational choice, has probably contributed to it too, because you have the propaganda for 30 years about overpopulation that came out of that.
Right, for sure.
So I was thinking, like, it seems to me you had implicitly you had all some policy proposals that they could use, but it would be very indirect.
They are policy proposals. They're indirect. They relate to sort of creating I don't like to say create. I don't think government creates much. I would say they relate to sort of fostering or respecting the sphere of human life which is prior to the state and which feeds the state, right? So, right, like the state can't command the cow to give milk, but the state can kind of protect like the pasture and make sure that, like, you know, marauding bands don't come and like kill the cows because they're methane producers. I mean, I wish that example were just fiction, of course, but it's not fiction. So yeah, it's not that there's no policy goals, and also it's not that I do not think the state can be neutral about what the goods are. So, and I certainly would reject the idea that the way we can sort of work out a vision for the future is by some kind of like liberal neutrality. But I will also say that I actually don't think anybody operate. I mean, this is a favorite whipping boy of the post-liberals, is that we've been ruined by liberal neutrality. I don't actually think there's been a lot of liberal neutrality. I mean, I think that, I think we see this today with Kamala Harris and some of the things Tim Walz. I mean, this is like super abortion lovers. These are people who really like abortion, like really like it. And I think that actually, if you dig back, you'll see that, you know, most of the people who've pushed the politically liberal abortion agenda over the last 50 years, they've been people who really like abortion and think of it as like a very fundamental part of the good of human society. It's like a good thing, right? It's not just it's not just something we tolerate as an evil. It's something that's really good. That's not liberal neutrality. We didn't allow and enshrine legal abortion because we said everybody should be free to abort their baby. We just used that as a political like ploy sometimes. But actually, obviously, these are people who don't really want abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. They think it should be, you know, I guess legal. Maybe safer than it was yesterday, but definitely pretty common. It's like if it's a fundamental right.
Sorry. Hello? Did I lose you?
I'm happy to. Well, yeah. The point is, I'm happy to say that I think that whatever it looks like to just sort of proclaim a liberal neutral, a liberal neutrality, I think is obviously a corrupt approach. And so, however limited I think the government is in accomplishing things, I don't think we should be limited in our ability to define the goods, and I don't think we have to be.
Yeah, and that might be an area where people talk past each other too. Joseph Ratzinger talks about the difference between a good secular state and a secularism, where he talks about how a secularism loses that good neutrality, and there is a sort of, we know what it is, it's functional, it's not absolute, it's not like how John Rawls presents it.
No,
but there is a sort of knowing, keeping government within its competence and its limits, and then outside of that it stays out of it. But doesn't mean the people that are operating are all neutral, you know, as far as.
No, that's right. I mean, I keep experimenting with the thought that at some point I want to develop and press this term of state incapacity. So so Tyler Cowen is famous now for developing state capacity libertarianism. But I think like my view is sort of like, not that it wouldn't be good to by fiat like say let's have all these good things that we want, but actually state's incompetent to do it, and not even incompetent, incapable. It's not able, right? It's not what it can do. But that claim comes out of a prior view about how civil society works. And certainly the Catholic Church has had a long history of talking about how civil society works, which I think is in tension with itself. I mean, I think it's clear that you can look at different threads of Catholic political thought and you find tensions there that are interesting. But certainly this sense of where the family sits as being, you know, essentially prior to the state and the first human society, that's really important. I think that has profound implications. And I think, you know, when the first Pope started writing about social realities, and we couldn't, what it meant to talk about the state was not the state we have today. We have this state today that could do things with the stroke of a pen that nobody imagined would be possible or permissible in the 19th century. And we proceed as if like when the popes say state in the 19th century, like it means the same thing as we think of as the sort of modern state. And I think that's just a real mistake in kind.
The book is Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Define the Birth Dearth. And I would just like to apologize to Professor Pakaluk because we are friends. I skipped over the intro. I should have talked about your Harvard PhD. You worked with a Nobel laureate, and that you've got a tremendous amount of work under your belt. Of course, you were here at Ave Maria. We were like ships passing in the night. You left when I got here. And that she is the director of social research at the Bush School of Business at CUA. So this book is just one of many accomplishments and a wonderful career. Won the Novak Award at Acton Institute of Human Ecology Center for. Are you still at CRCD?
I am. Yep.
Okay. Well, you know.
Proudly. Yeah.
That's right. That's something that I do too. It's called the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. Trey Dimsdale and Jordan Baller doing it for religious liberty. So I just apologize to you for not doing that at the top.
That's all right. We've come to a point in the history of this country where I have to apologize for having a degree from Harvard. At this point, I like to be introduced to sort of like, despite going to Harvard, she still has some interesting things to say. Or I tell students like, I went to Harvard, but it was still a respectable institution. And anyway, that's all just tongue in cheek, but thank you for the generous.
Of course. As soon as we get off this call, Tom and I are going to go check your dissertation for, malfeasance.
Oh yeah, please do. I'm an open book.
Thank you so much for coming on. It was
welcome.
such a pleasure to speak to you again, Catherine.
You're welcome. It's mutual.